Welcome to a special edition of Meet the Press Now, live from Milwaukee, where the debate stage is officially set for the first Republican presidential debate tomorrow night. And a very good day to you. I'm Kristen Welker, reporting from our NBC station, WTMJ, right here in Milwaukee. 8 candidates have met the Republican Party's polling and fundraising thresholds and signed a pledge to support the eventual GOP nominee. 4 candidates will not be on stage, and all 4 are taking issue with the RNC's requirements. But the biggest absence on tomorrow night's stage will be the Republican frontrunner, former President Donald Trump, who cited his commanding lead in the race as a reason not to attend. He also refused to sign the RNC's pledge to support the eventual nominee if it's not him. Heading into the debate, here's what several candidates are saying about Mr. Trump's absence.
Everybody should debate. Everybody has a responsibility to earn people's votes. Nobody is entitled to anything in this world, less of all the Republican nomination for president.
He's been on that debate stage countless times. He's also been U.S. president for 4 years. So if he wants to skip the first couple of them, I have no issue with that. But I do think he should be on the debate stage at some point throughout the course of this year.
I think it will be a vigorous exchange, even though Donald Trump will not be there. He's obviously going to be a topic of some of the conversation anyway, but we're going to contrast the ideas for the future that Americans want to be able to focus on.
Former President Trump's absence will be a major wild card tomorrow night as candidates try to appeal to Trump voters. And while Mr. Trump is counter-programming, first with his own media interview, then with his surrender to authorities in Georgia on Thursday, whether the debate or the arrest will shake up the former president's status as frontrunner remains an open question. Heading into the debate, I spoke to a Trump supporter in Iowa yesterday who, like many Trump supporters, told me his mind is made up.
He has said he voluntarily, I should say the team around him has said he has no plans to go to the debate because he's so far ahead in the polls. Do you want to see former President Trump on that debate stage?
I think it'd be nice to see him there, but also I think he's so widespread on social media and everything else that we know where he stands. The people behind him are 100% behind him, and we wouldn't rather have it any other way.
Additionally, new numbers out today from our NBC News Des Moines Register Mediacom poll serve as a stark reminder of where Republican primary voters stand on the former president's actions tied to the 2020 election. 51% of likely Republican Iowa caucus goers say they believe former President Trump's false claims that he won the 2020 election. That number rises to 60% among self-identified Republicans. Joining me now are reporters Blaine Alexander outside that Fulton County Courthouse in Atlanta, and Dasha Burns is here in Milwaukee with me. But Blaine, let me start with you. Former President Trump says he'll surrender to that Fulton County jail on Thursday. What can we expect? And walk us through what the terms of the bond agreement are.
Well, let me start, Kristen, with the terms of that bond agreement. $200,000 a bond has already been set. And the one thing that's notable that we've certainly seen when we talk about what he has to do in order to basically abide by those terms, he can't make any sort of intimidation. He can't make any sort of threats against co-defendants, against witnesses, against the public. And that includes social media posts. That is certainly notable, Kristen, of course, because we know that he communicates a lot on social media. We also know that that's language that was included in the former president's bond agreement that we haven't seen in any of the other bond agreements that have been agreed to so far. So that's what we can expect from the former president. A couple of developments, though. This really is kind of just an interesting flurry and cadence of people who have been turning themselves in or negotiating the terms under which they will surrender. So it's an interesting kind of dual screenshot here at the Fulton County Courthouse and at the Fulton County Jail. But just within the last hour or so, we heard from attorneys from Mark Meadows. They issued another filing. We know already that he had been trying to remove his case from Fulton County Court to federal court. Well, now he's asking a judge to basically hurry up and grant a hearing to have that moved, or to block the Fulton County DA from arresting him. So we're getting a very clear indication that the DA, if these co-defendants have not turned themselves in by Friday at noon, will very likely issue arrest warrants. I want to show you a little bit from that filing if we have that graphic, but basically they're saying that they spoke with the DA earlier today, and she's made it clear that she is not granting any extension, saying, I gave 2 weeks for people to surrender themselves to court. Your client is no different than any other criminal defendant in this jurisdiction. 2 weeks was a tremendous courtesy, she writes in her email, and says that at 12:30 p.m. on Friday, I shall file warrants in the system. So very much making it clear, and this is our first sign, Kristen, of what they plan to do if people do not surrender by this deadline. Kristen.
Fascinating, Blaine. A question for you, going back to the terms of the bond agreement that you mapped out in terms of former President Trump. What happens if he breaks that agreement?
And that's a great question. I mean, I think that we're already kind of seeing, just from what I just laid out in the Meadows filing, just the posture that the DA is taking in all of this in terms of making sure that, yes, the deadline is abided by, that the terms of the bond agreement are abided by as well. We know that there's something that she specifically signed off on. Also, Trump's attorney specifically signed off on that. So as to what the penalty would be if he breaks it, we don't know what that is, but she's certainly signaling that she plans to take action in other ways if people don't abide by the deadlines that she's setting.
And Blaine, we saw the first of 18 co-defendants surrender today. John Eastman, what did he have to say?
Yeah. Well, he came out of the jail. He was only there for about 90 minutes, which was certainly interesting in and of itself. He spoke to our Allie Vitale, and she asked him the question that certainly a lot of these co-defendants are going to be getting. Does he still believe that the 2020 election was stolen? Here's what he had to say. Take a look.
Do you still think the election was stolen?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Still.
No question. No question in my mind.
So that's what he said. Absolutely, no question. Believe that it was stolen, despite the fact that there's no evidence to show that it was stolen and evidence only to the opposite. So that's hearing from John Eastman. You know, I will say, though, that we can expect in the coming hours to see more people surrender to the Fulton County Jail. As we've seen the terms of the consent bond agreement worked out here, that really is an indication that surrender is imminent. And so we're watching that very closely, Kristen.
I know it's a busy time for you, Blaine Alexander. Dasha, let me turn to you. That's the backdrop for tomorrow night's big event here in Milwaukee. The debate stage is set. Former President Trump not expected to attend. What are you going to be watching for tomorrow night, Dasha? Mr. Trump's not going to be on the stage, but he's certainly still going to be front and center, right?
Well, that's exactly right, Kristen. And look, after the dog days of summer, for a lot of voters, this is really the first time that they're going to be tuning in, really listening. But this is, again, another major Republican event that the former president has snubbed, and yet he is looming over the whole thing. It is absolutely playing out under his shadow. He has counter-programmed. He's creating a split-screen moment. Well, while all of the other candidates are on the stage, he's got an interview with Tucker Carlson that has been pre-recorded. He's turning himself in Atlanta the following morning. We know that the hosts of the debate are going to be asking the candidates about former President Trump. And as I've been out on the campaign trail, I've been watching these candidates struggle to find their footing. How do you talk about the former president? How do you create that contrast without alienating his voters when he's polling so far ahead? We've seen that Iowa poll that we've put out, how far he's polling and how dedicated so many of his supporters are. And some of those will need to be peeled away in order for any of these candidates to make it through here. And so particularly that issue that is at the center of the indictment in Atlanta and the federal indictment as well, the issue of the 2020 election. You know, this is where you see candidates like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. In my interview with him, it took multiple follow-up questions, Kristen, to get him to say Trump lost the 2020 election. Well, that's exactly why, because so many voters, Republican primary voters in particular, that these candidates are trying to win over, the majority of them believe that Trump won the 2020 election, despite there not being any evidence of that. And they're going to really have to face that challenge head on the biggest platform they've had so far tomorrow night, Kristen.
You know, Dasha, it's so interesting because there are 4 candidates who did not make the debate stage. Some of them say that they plan to challenge the RNC on that. But look, I've been talking to, going back to Iowa, I've been talking to some caucus goers in Iowa who don't support former President Trump and who say, look, if you didn't qualify for the debate, it is time to drop out. What are you hearing about that? What are you hearing from these campaigns?
Well, this massive field is a problem. If you are going to have a Trump alternative, they need to consolidate around one, and that's what we've been hearing from strategists and, frankly, from voters who do want to turn the page on the former president. They want to see somebody really come out of the woodwork as that person that they can get behind. A lot of folks still considering Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Vivek Ramaswamy is a name I've been hearing a lot in Iowa. Tim Scott. The majority of people I've been meeting in states like Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina that aren't hardcore Trump supporters, their minds are still open. So I do think that tomorrow night is a big opportunity. The person who has perhaps the most to gain or lose is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. We know the knives are going to be out for him. If he can shine, if he can weather the storm, if he can bat away the potential attacks and really show the strength there, he could gain a lot of momentum. At the same time, if he doesn't have a great night, that could show some peril for his candidacy that has had a lot of struggles in recent months. Also an opportunity for others to have some moments with Trump being out of there. But a big night, but it's going to be tough for folks to get out from under the former president's shadow there, Kristen.
It sure will be. It is going to be a critical test for all of those candidates, that is for sure. Dasha and Blaine, beforehand, thank you both so much for your great reporting. I now want to bring in Charles Benson, anchor here at WTMJ Milwaukee, and Stephen Hayes, editor and CEO of The Dispatch and an NBC News contributor. Thanks to all of you for being here. Charles, thank you for having us in your beautiful studio and newsroom. We appreciate it. Let me start with you. Set the stakes for tomorrow night. What are voters here in Milwaukee and across the state going to be watching for? What are you going to be watching for?
Well, I think people in Wisconsin probably are more focused on who's going to be, or I should say, how well Jordan Love is doing as the Packers quarterback. And when I found out Stephen Hayes was going to be here, I thought that's what we were.
That was what we were going to talk about. That's the next segment.
Yes.
Okay.
But since there is this big debate in our backyard, people would ask me, do you think the former president will be here? And I said, I think that's a trick question, because I was thinking that maybe he would be here, but maybe not on the stage. So he's still going to have a presence. He's still very popular among the Republican Party in Wisconsin. But I do think this is a chance that a lot of Republican voters are going to say, if not Donald Trump, who? And so they're going to see those other 8 candidates. And how does he compare, knowing how well they know the former president and his message? So that's where I think Republican voters are going to lean in tonight and say, who are these guys? And the one-woman candidate, female, and whether or not they can be the next president or the one that they will want to back.
Stephen, what do you make of that? And you know, Dasha talked about the fact that this is a chance for a breakthrough moment, a viral moment. You almost need a viral moment at this point, because you're seeing how high up former President Trump is in the polls. I mean, what do you think these candidates need to do to break through to voters?
Well, I mean, the very first thing they need to do is provide some contrast to Donald Trump. Thus far, what's been the most remarkable thing about the Republican primary is most of them are running to win that 40% of people who are hardcore Trump supporters already. Ron DeSantis has built his campaign around trying to peel away some of those voters rather than focus on the 50+% of Republican voters who are gettable. Some of them like Donald Trump. Some of them thought he was a good president. Some of them can't stand Donald Trump. There are a lot of voters there. Our NBC poll of likely caucus goers in Iowa, 41% want Donald Trump to remain the head of the Republican Party. 57%, if you take the other 2 categories, are potentially gettable. And you have campaigns, other than Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson, Will Hurd, who won't be on the stage, that are built around going after the 41%. My big question tonight is, who drives the contrast? We know Chris Christie's going to do it. We know Asa Hutchinson's going to do it. Does anybody else take a step away and say, I'm taking on Donald Trump?
What do you make of the fact that we are seeing Ron DeSantis inch closer to trying to make that sharp contrast? Over the weekend, he referred to Mr. Trump's supporters he appeared to as being listless, kind of doubled down on those comments. What do you make of the fact that he seems to be sharpening his tone? Is that a sign we could see him sharpen his tone at the debate?
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, he made the comments that you said, and then his campaign went on and blamed it on the left-wing media for misinterpreting what he said. They didn't misinterpret what he said. They just reported what he said, and what he said was, particularly Donald Trump's supporters in Congress, were these listless vessels and sort of following a cult leader. They weren't conservative. Now, if Ron DeSantis decides to make the argument that Donald Trump wasn't conservative in the same way that Ron DeSantis is conservative, pointing to people like Chip Roy and others in Congress who have endorsed Ron DeSantis, then you might start to see some of that contrast. But unless and until he does that, and unless and until he points that out, he shouldn't leave it to us to interpret what he's doing or to say, oh, I think that might have been a shot at Donald Trump. He needs to say it.
Charles.
I know it's a national audience, but in Wisconsin, if you look at one poll back in June, which now seems like ancient history on Marquette, when voters, Republican voters, were asked between Trump and DeSantis, DeSantis moves well ahead of the former president in that one poll. So I think a lot of voters, because they've heard about DeSantis, he's been on the ground here a couple of times in Wisconsin, they're going to see how does he handle the stage with all these other contenders. I also wonder about Mike Pence, who has had trouble sort of grasping or getting some traction. He's a guy who spent a lot of time in Wisconsin for the former president. So I'm curious to see if he has a breakthrough moment as well, knowing that Wisconsin voters know him pretty well.
What do you think Wisconsin voters want to see from Ron DeSantis? Do you think they want to see him get tougher? As you point out, former President Trump's still pretty popular in this state. Or do you think they want him to focus on his policies?
So that's what I keep wanting. I still think policy is the most important at the end of the day. Look, when I talk to Republicans, they do not believe or are buying in Bidenomics. We saw the president here last week, the vice president here. They're selling their economic policy, and Republicans are not buying it. They don't see the benefits of that. So if DeSantis is going to try to talk about a governor who's done something in a state, I think that might be his talking points. And keep in mind, and Stephen will know this, when you look at Republican history in Wisconsin, sort of the breakthrough names, Paul Ryan, Scott Walker, right? Principled conservatives. So does he try to appeal to those folks who voted for those two guys, or does he need to have a breakout moment?
And we're going to hear from Scott Walker a little bit later on in the hour. Pick up on that point. And also, I think the question of former Vice President Mike Pence is a fascinating one. I was talking to caucus goers in Iowa who said, boy, he showed so much strength on January 6th, obviously the ones who don't support former President Trump, and yet I'm still not ready to support him. I've been talking to the Pence campaign, and they say the former vice president is going to view this as a chance to reintroduce himself to voters. How fascinating. He's the former vice president.
Yeah, he's probably come closest to this balance. You know, on the one hand, you have Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson and others who are they're going to take every opportunity to pound Trump. On the other hand, you have the group that's mostly echoing and amplifying Donald Trump's arguments. Mike Pence has not done that. He's taken this opening that January 6th and his actions on January 6th has given him and made an argument about it. Like, he didn't win the election. I had to do what I had to do. Will he find a way to make an appeal to those conservatives, to the Paul Ryan conservatives, to Scott Walker conservatives? The risk is, of course, Trump and others will say, oh, this is Mike Pence, the establishment, which is, you know, a toxic thing to be called in today's Republican Party. But I think if you stick to policy arguments, there's a lot of support for those the lower taxes, the bold reforms that Scott Walker introduced in Wisconsin.
Charles, final point to you. Is there any scenario where you see the decision to skip this first debate backfiring against former President Trump in this state or in any other state across the country?
So to me, it will be something that former Governor Scott Walker would say, because he was on the debate stage with Donald Trump. He knows him as a prize fighter, right? A guy who can land the knockout punch. But tonight, does something happen in a key moment, in a key exchange, that he gets the knockout and isn't there to defend it? I think that will be the next morning regret. The question is it in any one of these other 8 candidates to pull that off?
Great question. We'll leave it there. Fantastic conversation. Thank you both. Great to see you. Thank you again for hosting us. We appreciate it. Charles and Stephen, great conversation. And coming up, the third rail of a third-party ticket. I'll talk to Green Party candidate Cornel West about his bid for the White House amid growing anxiety among Democrats that a third-party challenger like him could spoil President Biden's re-election chances in 2024. But first, a special programming announcement. Make sure to tune in tomorrow night for a Meet the Press special following the first Republican debate with live analysis, reporting, interviews, and much, much more. That's at 11 p.m. Eastern right here on NBC News Now. We'll be right back with more Meet the Press Now, live from Milwaukee. Welcome back. Depending on where you live, the Democratic and Republican presidential nominees probably won't be the only big names on your ballot next November. As we've reported, the group No Labels is gaining ballot access across the country and is considering running a moderate third-party candidate if President Biden and former President Trump are the Democratic and Republican Party nominees. Joe Manchin and Jon Huntsman have both been floated as possible independent candidates on that ticket. And Cornel West, professor, political activist, and former Bernie Sanders presidential backer, is seeking the Green Party's presidential nomination. And joining me now is Green Party presidential candidate and Union Theological Seminary professor, Cornel West. Thank you so much, Professor West, for being here. Really appreciate it.
What a blessing. And I salute you in this wonderful new job, so very well deserved. It's beautiful to see you flowering and flourishing, I should say, from Harvard Yard to now Meet the Press. That's beautiful.
Thank you, Professor West. I appreciate that so much. Thank you. And thank you for being here. We do want to talk to you about your candidacy, which has gotten a lot of attention. And I want to start off by asking you about it in this context. Your longtime political ally, Senator Bernie Sanders, he's not a Democrat, but he did, as you know, run twice in the Democratic presidential primary. So let me just put the question to you. Why have you decided to run as a third-party candidate rather than a Democrat challenging President Biden?
Yes, I mean, Bernie Sanders, as you know, is my very dear brother. I have a deep love for him. We have disagreement at this historical moment. I'm thoroughly convinced that neither party is speaking to the pressing needs of poor and working people. And so the two-party system itself is becoming an impediment for the flowering of American democracy. We've got too many fellow citizens, 63%. Living paycheck to paycheck. And many of us know exactly what that means, no matter how big or small our check actually is. And so in that sense, I must say that it's hard to view oneself as a spoiler when there's increasing rot in the system with two parties connected to big money, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and militarism abroad. And we need, and really the anthem of Black people, lift every voice. We need many, many more voices, and the two parties that we have are too narrow at this point.
Well, I'm curious because you say this is a moment where you're not necessarily seeing eye to eye with your good friend, Senator Bernie Sanders. Have you spoken to him about your candidacy? As you know, he's already endorsed President Biden.
No, we've had no dialogue. I can feel his love at a distance. I hope he can feel my love at a distance. But no, we've had no dialogues about it, not at all. And as you know, I was very close to him for two campaigns. And I just don't think the Democratic Party treated him fairly. They didn't treat him justly. Democratic Party was too anti-democratic. And I think both establishments in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party, they are undergoing a slow erosion. I think one of the reasons why you get a Trump is because the Democratic Party establishment has eroded. I think you're going to see it in many ways in the debate tomorrow night. You know, we just don't have the high quality. So you end up with a lot of Pied Piper language at Trump, but he's in so many ways beneath mediocrity, God bless him. And then with Biden, you've got milquetoast mediocrity. Where are the great visionary statespersons that come in and intervene as this country is undergoing polarization and gangsterization? In the name of integrity, honesty, decency, and generosity, we have got to have new voices on the scene. That's why I'm running for president.
Let me ask you about your past position. In 2004, you signed a letter of former Ralph Nader advisors urging progressives in swing states to vote for John Kerry. I'm going to read you a little bit of this letter that you signed. Quote, This year, we urged support for Carrie Edwards in all swing states, even while we strongly disagree with Carrie's policies on Iraq and other issues. For people seeking progressive social change in the United States, removing George W. Bush from office should be the top priority in the 2004 presidential election. Progressive voters for John Kerry in swing states may prove decisive in attaining this vital goal. If you believed that in 2004, Dr. West, how do you rationalize your third-party candidacy this time around?
Well, it's a wonderful question because, as you know, I supported Brother Biden, given my profound disagreement with Biden as architect of mass incarceration, as supporter of invasion and occupation of Iraq. Why? Because I was thoroughly convinced that what the Republicans were presenting was so dangerous. But the sad thing is now, is that as dangerous as a second Trump term would be, if we don't break out of the corporate duopoly, we're going to be doing this for the next 10, 20, and 30 years. And I don't think the American project can withstand it. This shift from Democrats to Republicans, Democrats feeding the Republicans, Republicans feeding the Democrats, and yet poor people, working people, finding themselves pushed to the margins. It could be Cop City, both parties support. It could be expansion of military budget, both parties support. It could be policies advantageous to Wall Street, both parties support. And as you know, this is the 60th anniversary of Brother Martin Luther King's great speech. And I've always viewed myself as my own humble calling, trying to keep alive the great legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, and Diane Nash. And that tradition has to continue on and on. I think of Les McCann's great classic, compared to what, 1969? Compared to what at this point with these parties? Let's try something new.
Dr. West, as you know, though, if you look back throughout history, third-party candidates have at times made the difference in presidential elections, including in 2016, when in some key states, Jill Stein, for example, seemed to make a difference. Would you be okay if at the end of the day, the vote totals came back, you stayed through the entire race, and it was clear that your candidacy helped deliver former President Trump another term in office?
Well, the vast number of voters who would vote for a Green Party and myself either would not vote at all or would never, ever, ever vote for Biden or Trump. And that's very important to keep in mind, because there's this narrative, I think it's a false narrative, thinking that somehow they're choosing between Biden and myself. No, not really. They've given up on Biden. What is it now? 48% of our precious fellow citizens do not vote at all, my dear sister. That's not a good sign in a democracy that's already in decay. That's not a good symptom of a democracy already experiencing a kind of decadence. We've got to bring new people in, and neither party is really interested in speaking to that 48% that has given up on American democracy.
What do you say to your fellow progressives, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senator John Fetterman, who've expressed their real concerns about a third-party candidacy? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says, quote, "It's very difficult to square the very real threat of a Republican presidency with the risk of giving up the very small margin of electoral votes needed to ensure that President Biden wins." John Fetterman says, "I fundamentally believe that you don't mess around with the kinds of highest stakes we're dealing with. Can you just imagine what a second term of Trump would be? It's all going to be about revenge." What do you say to your fellow progressives who are expressing deep concerns about a third-party candidacy?
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind is that 1 out of 8 of the voters for Trump voted for Bernie Sanders. See, the Trump followers are not homogeneous and monolithic. If you can speak to their pain, if you can speak to their frustration, they will never vote for Democrats. But many of them would be open to those who are speaking to their needs. They don't have to follow the Pied Piper, the old-fashioned Pied Piper with Trump. A new vision, a different alternative can convince a significant number of them. And so, again, I'm resisting the notion that somehow it's just a matter of myself and Brother Biden that people are choosing between. No, we've got large numbers of non-voters who are interested, especially young people. Look at the percentage of young people. Only 20-some% participate at all. I want to speak to those young folk. I want to try to galvanize their energy.
Dr. West, I'm getting a hard rap, so just yes or no. Are you in this until the very end, or is there a chance you'll reconsider at some point and potentially drop out?
Well, I am a jazz man, you know that, but I intend to be in it to the very end because it's not just about, it's not about this particular election only. It's about a larger movement. We've got to break the two-party system, and to do it is now. And if we don't do it now, we'll find ourselves back and forth with this swing between the fascists on the one hand and the neoliberals on the other.
All right. Professor Cornel West, thank you so much for your time and your perspective. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Salute you. Salute you.
You too. Coming up next, DeSantis' debate drama. I'll talk to one of Ron DeSantis' top campaign officials about the governor's strategy heading into tomorrow night after a leaked memo outlined an attack plan that included defending Donald Trump. Stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back to a special edition of Meet the Press Now, live from Milwaukee ahead of tomorrow night's first Republican presidential debate. As we noted, frontrunner Donald Trump will be skipping the debate, arguably putting added pressure on the field's current runner-up, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who will be the next closest thing to a frontrunner on that stage. For a preview of what we can expect from the governor tomorrow night, I'm joined by Deputy Campaign Manager for the DeSantis campaign, David Polyansky. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So if you will, take us inside debate prep. What is the strategy for tomorrow night?
Well, look, the strategy is pretty clear. This is an opportunity for the governor to spend a couple hours talking to the American people and, most importantly, Republican primary voters across the country and really introducing himself and, most importantly, sharing his proven conservative record, which the beauty for us is I think a lot of our peers and competitors tonight are probably meeting in rooms trying to hash out a strategy of talking points and how they're going to frame and, in many cases, fake a record. We don't have that problem.
So what does a successful night look like for Governor DeSantis? He's obviously #2 in the polls. He's the only other candidate who gets double digits. We just released our poll of Iowa caucus goers yesterday. Does he need a viral moment to kind of break through tomorrow night? What are you hoping happens?
Well, not at all. I mean, if you look at, to your point, if you look at the Iowa numbers in particular, we're sitting in a pretty strong position, especially from a historical context. As you might know, at this point, Mike Huckabee was sitting in single digits and Senator Cruz was in single digits as well. So we feel like we're leaps and bounds ahead of where we thought and needed to be at this point. So really his delivery tomorrow night is really introducing himself again and letting people know, number one, he's the only person on that stage to have worn our nation's uniform. He's the only veteran in the race. And by the way, not just out of the folks that are going to be on the stage, but some that will be in other states for other reasons. He's the only veteran in the race. And that's a pretty significant element for him. Number two, it's, again, talking about his conservative record. You look at the state of Florida, Republicans across the country know that he's got a strong record. They probably know a little bit about COVID, but there's so much more to that record that he's going to introduce tomorrow night, and we're very excited about that chance.
He's been getting some headlines for a comment that he made this week, and I want to play a little bit of it and just get your reaction on the other side.
We have a strand in our party that views supporting Trump as whether you are a rhino or not. And so you could be the most conservative person since sliced bread. Unless you're kissing his rear end, they will somehow call you a rhino. If all we are is listless vessels that's just supposed to follow, you know, whatever happens to come down the pike on Truth Social every morning, that's not going to be a durable movement.
So we want to be clear. Today, the governor clarified that the comments were actually directed toward members of Congress. But do you worry that that type of a comment runs the risk of alienating some parts of the Trump base?
No, I think it's a good reminder to all of us that call ourselves Republicans that we need to be bound by principle, conservative principles, and not married to an individual, but married to the ideology that makes our party, in our case, what we find the most impressive and important elements of our party. And, you know, to that point, I think the governor's also reminding us that we need to be out here today focused on being in a position to have a candidate that's standing on that stage trying to earn the vote of our party. And in this case, the former president and many of his allies aren't here. They're not here advocating. They're not here trying to earn the support of our party. They might be elsewhere preoccupied.
I want to play something. I was out in Iowa yesterday talking to voters. I talked to one gentleman who said he really likes Governor Ron DeSantis, but he's starting to cool on him a little bit. Take a listen to what he had to say.
Right now, in the poll, I said Nikki Haley. Ron DeSantis had some appeal to us early, but some of his opinions are a little too harsh, I think. After the election, we need someone who can unite people, and I see DeSantis as another person who's divisive versus someone who can build a coalition and move us forward.
What do you say to that voter, and how's Governor DeSantis going to answer voters who say, hey, wait a minute, he's going too far to the right of former President Trump?
Well, what I'd say is, number one, we have to earn that gentleman's support, and it's incumbent upon all of us, and as part of this campaign, to go out there and earn it. And as the governor is traveling, he's already hit 38 of 99 Iowa counties, and by the end of this weekend, we'll be at 52 or 53 of them. He's going to have the chance to meet that gentleman and others and have those conversations one-on-one. Number two, though, I think it's important to point out that in the Iowa poll, Governor DeSantis has the highest favorability out of any candidate in the field. And when you talk about, not just vote share, but the opportunity share here, the consider ballot, former president's at 63% of all voters in that state. We're at 61%, meaning we've got not only a really strong hold on second position, but more importantly, we've got the position and the opportunity to grow significantly, and that's what we're going to see. And hopefully we can earn that gentleman's support as part of that growth.
Let me ask you about this memo that came out attributed to the DeSantis super PAC, which effectively calls for the governor to attack Vivek Ramaswamy, but defend former President Trump, which a lot of people thought was a head scratcher. Why would you be attacking Vivek Ramaswamy, who's behind DeSantis in the polls? He's been gaining momentum, though. Is that what we're going to see tomorrow night?
Well, look, unsurprising, during debate season, you get a lot of advice and counsel. In fact, my text chain is full of my mom's own advice. This memo was put in a public way, in a public arena. It was never viewed or read by the governor himself. We didn't see it until the press notified of its existence. It hasn't been a part of our strategy, nor is it going forward.
But will he be attacking Vivek Ramaswamy? Will he have some sharp words for him?
Again, tomorrow night, the governor's mission is twofold. It's to introduce his bio and introduce his record. And I think that alone is a pretty sharp contrast, again, to everybody that will be on the stage tomorrow night, and some that are going to be in other states for other reasons.
All right. Well, it's so great to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And we will be watching tomorrow night. David Polyansky. And after the break, we are live in Hawaii on the heels of Joe Biden's presidential visit to the state yesterday afternoon, where he promised to rebuild the communities hardest hit by those historic wildfires. We'll have the very latest from the ground. Do stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press Now, live from Milwaukee. Welcome back. President Biden visited Maui last night, 2 weeks after wildfires ripped through parts of the island. Speaking to the local community, the president pledged long-term support for the island in the recovery and rebuilding process.
I want you to know the entire country is here for you. That's not hyperbole. We mean that. The entire country is here for you. We just surveyed the damage. I want you to know, whatever it takes, as long as it takes. I look at your congressmen and senators and governor and lieutenant governor.
President Biden's visit came as the death toll from the fires rose to at least 115. Officials revealed this morning that all of the single-family homes in the area have now been searched. The search for the missing continues in multifamily and commercial buildings now. Joining me now is NBC News correspondent Steve Patterson from Hawaii. So, Steve, still so much pain there where you are. Walk us through the president's visit and what the response was.
You know, Kristen, I think it's fair to say that there's been a bit of mistrust from residents to leadership, and be it local leadership, county leadership, state leadership, and yes, federal leadership. A lot of people here felt that the president should have said more in the days and the aftermath following that fire. So it was vital that he was giving that message that he gave yesterday. I think a lot of residents reacted positively, that seeing the president on the ground in the devastation, talking to family members, interfacing with local leadership and county leadership and state leadership, just important to the optics of what is and what will be a heartbreaking, incredibly long recovery and rebuilding process. But I still think there are other people that say, we hear you talking, but we don't know what that will transition into when the media attention is gone, when this moves into a different phase where there isn't the same amount of help and attention on our community. So it's a worry, and I think that is the overall emotion here. People here are just so worried about the future, about the rebuilding, about whether or not they'll get their properties back or rebuilt, that I think it translates into that level of mistrust. But the president's visit, greatly important to the people here. Kristen?
Steve, we have less than a minute left. Very quickly, what is the latest on the recovery efforts?
Yeah, quickly, Kristen, as you mentioned, single-family residents have been searched. That is 100% done. Now those search crews are moving into multi-story commercial buildings, apartment complexes, condo buildings, nursing homes, schools. You have to think about the level of loss that could be in places now as this moves into another phase. Kristen?
Steve Patterson, thank you so much for your reporting. And still to come, I'll talk to a former Republican presidential candidate who knows a thing or two about running against Donald Trump. That's when we come right back. Stay with us. Welcome back. As we mentioned, we're just over 24 hours away from the first Republican presidential debate. Tomorrow night, we'll get to hear 8 candidates make the case on why they should be the 2024 presidential nominee. Of course, the elephant in the room is who's not in the room. Frontrunner Donald Trump, who is choosing not to attend. Joining me now to discuss all of this is former Wisconsin Republican Governor Scott Walker. He is also president of the Young America's Foundation, which is partnering with the RNC for tomorrow night's debate. Governor, thank you for being here. Great to see you.
Good to be with you.
Wonderful to be here in Milwaukee with you.
Welcome.
Yes, thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I was in Iowa, actually, yesterday, talking to caucus goers there and talking to caucus goers who support former President Trump, who do not support former President Trump, but they agreed he should be on the debate stage. What say you about that?
Oh, 100%. In fact, our group, Young America's Foundation, just did a poll about a week ago of college and high school students, and they said the same thing. Overwhelmingly, they wanted to hear from all the candidates. Conventional wisdom in politics would be he's so far ahead, don't come. But Donald Trump's never been a conventional candidate. I stood next to him 8 years ago on that first debate stage. He took charge. He took command. I, quite frankly, am a little bit surprised that he's not going to be in Milwaukee for that debate.
Do you think that voters can get a clear picture of the entire Republican field without him on the stage? Because, as you know, he will still be front and center, whether he's physically there or not.
Well, I think it does provide an excellent opportunity, whether it's Ron DeSantis, Tim Scott, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, whomever, somebody's going to have, or maybe a couple are going to have breakthrough moments. It does give them a chance to stand out if they take that opportunity and run with it. That would be different if he was there. Like I said, I've stood on that stage with him a number of times. It's hard to get a word in edgewise. It's hard to make a difference. So in that regard, it's helpful. I hope the moderators do a good job of, they can't ignore him entirely, but hopefully the entire debate isn't about that. I hope maybe a little bit about the indictments, a little bit about his non-presence, but the rest hopefully covers issues people care about.
Well, you take me to my next question. What will you be watching for specifically tomorrow night? And what do the candidates need to do to have one of those breakout moments to really make a difference?
Yeah, 2 things, particularly in a state like Wisconsin, a battleground state, is they've got to make a connection and look like they're fighting, but not for the sake of fighting, but fighting for people like the people watching at home. I filled up my gas tank on my Chevy Traverse this weekend over at Quick Trip, just not too far from here. And I think a lot of us, at least in the Midwest, are shocked seeing, gas prices are almost $4 a gallon. For people who are worried about that, for the worried about the cost of filling up their grocery cart and all these other issues out there, I think they want to hear not just some economic plan, but what are you actually going to do that's going to make their life and more important, the lives of their children better. That's the kind of breakthrough moment that I think at least one, if not multiple candidates need to make.
We are here in Wisconsin, a state that has been so close in the past several presidential election cycles. Big picture, how do you stand out? You're talking about the economy, which, by the way, Iowa voters are saying that's their top issue as well. But what ultimately makes the difference at the finish line?
Yeah, it's amazing. Even in the economy in this poll we did with young people, even they listed it number one, which would defy what we've commonly heard. And I think that's because, again, as costs go up and that, it's not just the plan, it's the connection. I said you got to be bold, but also have believability. One of the big mistakes I made 8 years ago on that debate stage was I listened to the D.C. consultants who said, run on your record. You got this bold record, in some ways similar to Governor DeSantis. People respected what we did as governor. But that just gets you on the stage. And so I think one of the key things, whether it's DeSantis or any of the others out there, they've got to stand up and really capture people's imagination is that, yes, this is what it would be like for the next 4 years if he or she is the next president of the United States.
I want to ask you about Ron DeSantis because he recently said there's a strand of the Republican Party that measures if a candidate is Republican or not by the veracity of their loyalty to Donald Trump. Do you agree with that statement? And was it potentially a mistake for him to go that far?
I think it probably was. I mean, I think, again, as we've said, there are plenty of people who support Donald Trump, even throughout this latest controversy, who aren't necessarily viewing him as their number one pick in 2024, but like a family member. You might have a member of your family, may not even be your favorite member of the family, but when that person's under attack, you tend to gravitate to surround them, support them. And I think that's what a lot of voters feel like. My advice for months has been, don't talk about Donald Trump. The only person who can change a voter's mind about Donald Trump is Donald Trump. For or against, it's not going to alter things. So you look at, I think part of the reason why Vivek's going up is because he's just talking about his plans. He's really not talking a lot, at least not attacking Donald Trump. That's why I think a person who watched the debate is Senator Tim Scott. He's not attacked President Trump. He's talked about his own agenda, and he's willing to take risks. Heck, the guy went on The View. I think people will give him credit for things like that.
It sounds like you do see some parallels between your campaign and Ron DeSantis's campaign. An Iowa voter yesterday told me they actually really liked Ron DeSantis, but then felt like he'd been too extreme on some of the issues. How do you think he starts to win some of those voters back? What would your advice be for him at this critical stage in the race?
Yeah, the kicker is, again, think about what got him to be governor and be reelected as governor, and then multiply that to a national audience. So he didn't just win on personality. He won because people go 1, 2, 3. These are the things you get with Ron DeSantis, or I did the same sort of thing here in Wisconsin. So far, I haven't seen that. You know, whether you agreed with it or not, 8 years ago, Donald Trump said, I'm going to build a wall, I'm going to drain the swamp. He had a whole litany of things that he was going to do. He talked about in the debates, he talked about in the stub. And every American, no matter who they were, knew what that was. Governor DeSantis and the other candidates, for that matter, if they're going to break through and get even remotely close to catching up to the president, have got to have those kind of moments.
We got a new poll number out today. Half of likely Republican Iowa caucus goers believe Mr. Trump won the 2020 election. Is that something you're comfortable with?
Well, I think, again, part of it is because they're so frustrated with legitimate problems that have been identified in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Arizona and elsewhere.
Even though there was no proof of fraud despite countless court cases.
No, but a good example in Wisconsin. No dispute over this fact. Over 200,000 ballots were cast by absentee ballot that didn't follow the state law. Now, was it fraud? Part of it was confusions during COVID. Part of it was things like here in Milwaukee or Dane County where they handed out absentee ballots at parks, even though the law says you actually have to ask for them in writing. Now, is that enough to change the election? We don't know. My view is...
Multiple judges found there was no proof of widespread fraud.
Well, the Supreme Court refused to take it up here in Wisconsin. That was the problem. But I'm not even arguing about that. My point is there are legitimate things that need to be looked at and correct for future elections. I think it's wasted time for anybody, whether you're on the left or the right. I actually think part of the backfire at the indictment is that the left doesn't want to look back either. Elections are always about the future. They're never about the past.
Very quickly, should the candidates who did not qualify for the debate tomorrow night drop out of the race? Is it
I don't see other reason why. I mean, the bottom line is if you're not on the debate stage, your chances are next to nil. Even a bunch of the folks that made it may actually be not too far from the tail end either. But the bottom line is you've got to be in a position where you can talk to the voters, share your ideas. Now, someone who's polling a little bit lower could move up, but they got to have that breakthrough moment.
Governor Scott Walker, so great to see you. Thank you.
Thanks for being in Wisconsin.
Really appreciate it. Thanks for having us. And thank you for being with us this hour. Chuck is back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. And don't forget to tune in tomorrow night for a Meet the Press special after the debate. That's at 11 p.m. Eastern right here on NBC News Now. The news continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.